Russia and America wrap up a cloak and dagger tensions. On December 28th last year, Russia arrested the former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan on suspicion of spying in Moscow. The following day, the U.S. detained Russian citizen in the Pacific island of Saipan and moved to Florida on charges of transporting military equipment to Russia. The tit-for-tat arrests led experts to believe that Moscow could trade the Whelan for Russian nationals held by Washington. The Russian deputy foreign minister saw no need for an exchange, saying Russia would instead go through all the necessary procedures. For his part, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Washington would demand Whelan's immediate return if it was determined his detention was inappropriate. The arrests were the tip of the iceberg in a decades-long rift between Russia and the U.S. Espionage activities of both sides have been going on since the end of Cold War. The recent exchange of accusations and arrests have only added fuel to the fire. So what lies beneath the friction between Russia and the United States? Let's turn to our panel. In our Beijing studio, we have Alexander Lukin, a professor and director of East Asian and SCO Studies at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Sir, welcome to the Beijing studio.
Thank you.
Good to see you here. And also in Beijing, Rick Dunham, the director of the Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University, a veteran political journalist coming from Washington, D.C. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
I want to start by asking you, Mr. Lukin, how much does it matter, the current debate about the spies from both sides, U.S. and Russia?
We don't even know if there are real spies or not, but even if they are spies, there is nothing so special about it. We are not allies with the United States.
The casualties, the front-line casualties, usually two sides picking on each other's spies when they try to pick pains of one another. That's always a practice during the Cold War. But Professor, do you think that's likely to continue this time? Is it a sign of anything much further and deeper than this?
It's too early to say that this is a spy tit-for-tat. I mean, it may just be collecting chits for political exchanges as opposed to the old Cold War style, we release one of your spies, you release one of ours. I mean, right now it's just such a deep political divide between establishment Washington and the Russian government. Not necessarily the Trump White House, but the bigger government and American establishment.
What about that divide, according to you, Professor Lukin?
Well, there is a divide, of course. We look at the world very differently. Not even only the Russian government, but also the majority of the Russian elite. The United States want to dominate the world, but they cannot do it, and they're very unhappy about it. And the United States doesn't have a concept of equal relationship. Well, Russia wanted an equal relationship for a long time, but in 2014 we understood that it's completely impossible. So that's the situation.
You know, Professor Lukin, there's a reality that we really need to take a look at. The things are coming in so many different layers. I mean, on the one hand, U.S. and former USSR were in Cold War, and now Russia and the United States are not anymore in Cold War, and yet not necessarily on good terms either. Secondly, you got the Trump White House, with the president seems to be, at the very beginning of his presidency, want to get closer to Moscow, and with the latter rather agreeing on that possibility, but it was establishment Washington that do not necessarily interested in it. And then you got also within the United States itself, they do not agree with one another as to how to deal with Russia and what to do with Russia in the future. So Professor Lukin, when you look at these divides, how do you think the current issue could lead us to, and where would it lead us to?
Spy issue is not important. We have much more important issues, I think.
Exactly. It's not important, but it is something coming to the surface. The reason why it is coming to the surface does tell part of the story, or is the preface could be of some story.
The problem is the differences in the world views and in approaches to the world. Russia wants to be treated like an equal country, and the United States cannot do it. Everything else is like secondary. I mean, even during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was dealt with kind of respect, and that's why we could have come to some kind of agreements, including the spy issues. We had a lot of spies at that time, we exchanged them, but if you are treated like a secondary country, and then you cannot come to any kind of agreement.
Yeah.
And we don't have agreements, and actually Russia does not care too much about it, because we don't have a lot of trade with the United States, we don't have deep kind of relationship with, so we think if they don't want to deal with us with respect, we don't deal with you. If you want to talk to us, let's talk. If you don't want to, we're going to talk to someone else.
Well,
nobody cares too much.
Moscow, according to Professor Lukin, is quite clear in that attitude. Is it? Is that what you're reading?
I think, well, he's right. That's the attitude from Moscow. And, I mean, he reads Washington pretty well. I mean, there is not a lot of respect for Russia in official Washington. If you have, I mean, the economy has just been terrible over the past 20 years. It's about the GDP about the size of the state of New York. Now, it is a very important military power, and there is respect and fear for that. Russian arms are all over the world right now, from Africa to the Middle East. And so, yes, I mean, you have to deal with that. But China obviously is the second economic power in the world, and then you have, I mean, Japan, the European Union, and many others before you would think of Russia. And as the professor said, there's very little bilateral trade between the United States and Russia. So it's a military, I mean, it's military relationship.
Security.
And it's security antagonism, though. I mean, when he was talking about the time his father was the ambassador, I mean, that was a time of hope. You had Senators Lugar and Nunn, and you were talking about getting rid of weapons and cooperating in security issues. We're beyond that. Donald Trump is unilaterally canceling arms treaties right now, and so I think we're entering a tougher period than even the difficult last decade.
Some say winter has seen a Cold War heating up, a new Cold War. Whether that is true or not, take a look at some of the things happening over the past few months. On November the 29th, U.S. President Donald Trump abruptly canceled a planned meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit. On December the 4th, Mr. Trump threatened to leave the INF treaty if Russia allegedly continued to violate it, according to him, that is, of course. On December the 28th, Russia detained a former U.S. Marine, and also the following day, the U.S. detained a Russian citizen. On January the 6th, a U.S. Navy landing ship arrived in the Black Sea. So one after another, it seems that the rhythm of the drum is getting ever more intense and faster. So Professor Lukin, you're very good with a geopolitical analysis. Now, is it the period of time in which Moscow and Washington are just going to take one step back and say, whatever, we're not necessarily interested in one another. We have bigger priorities. Is that what Moscow has in mind?
Well, as I said, Moscow is not fighting with the United States. One of my colleagues called this a unilateral Cold War. They're fighting with us, but we don't fight with them.
But you think about the Middle East, for example, that whether Syria or not, the U.S. troops presence going to be there. If you think about some of the other hotspot issues inside Europe as well, certainly the U.S. and Moscow are not necessarily seeing eye to eye on many things, and they are tackling some of the very important, strategically important issues.
Well, we do have some cooperation on the ground in the Middle East, in Syria, for example. And if the United States government would like to somehow make it deeper, Russia would be happy to do it. But we don't understand the United States, what the United States wants to do there. The problem is that Washington doesn't understand it itself, I think, because sometimes they say they want to change regime, sometimes they say they want to help the Kurds, sometimes now they announce that they want to withdraw their troops.
What's Moscow's bottom line, though?
Well, Moscow is there on legal basis and helping the legitimate government to maintain order in the country. I think it's
what about
clear.
Moscow's bottom line in terms of what the U.S. could do in the region?
And the best thing is what Trump is doing, is just get out of there.
But you see, within the last 24 hours, Donald Trump's national security advisor,
Right.
John Bolton, contradicted him, said, we're not going to do what Donald Trump said to the Turkish president. We're going to stay there until Erdogan promises not to massacre the Kurds,
Right.
and until ISIS is completely destroyed. So the problem is nobody knows what if Donald Trump said something, if it actually is going to happen. They don't know if he tweets something, if this is a
Right.
policy, or if somebody's going to contradict it, and it's just
Well,
inoperative.
that we know for about 2 to 3 years already
Right,
so far
exactly.
since he come into the office, the unpredictability so-called. But what does that mean for Moscow? Does it mean more opportunities for Moscow? Many wonder.
Well, Russia doesn't have any goals in Syria except that it wants to maintain the political stability there. I'm quite happy that if the United States withdraws and if the situation is stable, the Russian troops will also withdraw from Syria. They may maintain this naval base, but not more.
Right,
than
I would
that.
disagree. I mean, the key is stability, to have Assad on the throne in Syria, but to have a naval base on the Mediterranean, and that's going to stay. I mean, and that's going to stay because Donald Trump has no objection to it either.
And what does that mean for the U.S. longer term? Is Russia trying to take advantage of the current situation from your perspective?
Well, I think the difference is that President Putin has a long-term vision. Donald Trump doesn't, and so I mean, perhaps he's taking advantage of the instability and the chaos inside the U.S. government. But I think it's just following through. I think President Putin is just following through on his long-term vision for Russia's role in the world, and particularly that part of Europe, if you would start at Ukraine and end in the Mediterranean.
But Russia has always been a card that you see politicians in Washington play from time to time, particularly during the election season. Mr. Professor Lukin, what about that? I mean, from now until the next election cycle in the U.S., 2 years, and yet with the current political fights already quite heated up in both the Senate and the House of Representatives, will Russia be one of those things that politicians from both sides once again want to pick up on, particularly inside Washington? And what would Russia's strategy to deal with the negative impact of that?
Well, I don't think that Russia
Being the collateral damage of internal political struggle inside Washington.
I don't think that Russia should care too much about the internal political struggle. The current policy is shared, well, the main ideas of this policy or directions are shared by the entire political class. So it's not going to change after Trump goes. Trump may be kind of extravagant, has extravagant style, but the basis of this policy is, as I said, the attempts of other countries to become important in the world, which Washington doesn't want to tolerate. Mr. Obama said, a very liberal president, said that when he was arguing for TPP, he said that we, but not countries like China, should decide on international trade rules. So it did not start with Trump. Trump just has, as I said, his strange style, but so it's not going to finish with him. So we should not expect, neither in Russia or I would say in China, a significant change in policies. Maybe in style, just in style.
Just in style, in order to deal with the current Washington. Is that what you're saying?
So we don't have to care if Democrats or Republicans or anybody else are in power there. The main course will stay the same.
I agree over the long haul because both Democrats and Republicans rhetorically are strongly anti-Russia. in the short run, it's a little different because Democrats view it as a free shot now. I mean, Democrats used to be less critical of the Soviet Union than Republicans. Now Democrats feel free to just pile on, especially because of the scandal involving 2016 election. Republicans, while in terms of military issues criticize Russia, they're much more sensitive because of the potential political damage to Republicans of Donald Trump's campaign's relationship with Moscow in 2016.
And therefore, what does that mean for Moscow to develop other ties as well during this process? When you say that Russia does not want to be involved in this internal political fight inside Washington, but it is a matter of fact that you are involved, maybe passively, but certainly being one factor there. So what does that mean for Russia? How could you counter the negative impact once again?
We don't have to fight the negative factor because it does not depend on Russia. I mean,
you sound like the
American
Chinese philosophical way of doing Wu Wei. Everything you said, we don't need to deal with it. We don't need to think about it. We don't need to care about it. It doesn't matter.
Look, in Washington, they want to create scapegoats. Russia is one of the scapegoats. China is another scapegoat. So what can we do about it? Should we come there and say, oh, look, we are not a scapegoat. We are very good people? I don't think we should do that. I think that, you know, maybe craziness will go away from Washington at some point, and they'll understand it themselves, that they cannot fight everybody at once, at least. That's what the realists say. For example, people like Kissinger. Even when they, for example, when Kissinger and people like him were close to power, they tried to use Russia against China and China against Russia. Even from American point of view, this was a wiser policy, I think. But now they're trying to fight everyone at once. You cannot afford such a policy for a long time. Well, the Soviet Union tried to do it, and it collapsed because it's overstretched its resources. So you cannot really fight everyone at once. So I think someone will sooner or later understand this in Washington.
Professor Denham, before we go.
I mean, on the fight everyone at once, I agree. Trump can't fight the EU. I mean, he's picking enemies among traditional friends as well as traditional adversaries, and it won't work. But I mean, to have some sort of agreement, I don't think that just playing old adversarial relationships does very much.
Good to have both of you being here in Beijing. Alexander Looking, Rick Denham. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being with us.